Hey folks, Happy New Year, and for those of you who are new to the Faculty of Education here at U Ottawa, welcome. And for those of you who are returning, I hope you had a restful winter break, and I hope you're coming back to classes feeling refreshed and ready to learn. So in this video, I'm introducing multiliteracy circles, which is a process that you're going to be doing in both the classes I'm helping with this semester, EDU 5101 and EDU 5499. So here I want to talk a little bit about the group process so you kind of know what to expect, as well as share some tips based on my experiences using this in previous courses. So what are MLCs? Well, MLCs are a variation on literature circles. So online literature circles consist of small group-led groups that discuss the course readings, whether they be a textbook or articles. And there's different roles in these groups, which is meant to guide the learners through the readings and as well through their subsequent discussions that they have in their small groups. And these are meant to be really collaborative, and they're really meant to be an opportunity for you to bring in your own experiences with ideas that are presented within the literature and incorporate some of your own knowing. Now, what makes this a multiliteracy circle versus just a literature circle? Well, the idea here is that with the world we live in, things are becoming increasingly technological. So there's a need to approach literacy in a different way. So literacy is now multimodal because we need to be able to interact with electronic sources. So in the MLC format, you're bringing in sources beyond the traditional articles and textbooks that we would use in a course. So for example, bringing in things like websites and videos and things of that nature. And a benefit of using this type of literature circle in an online course is it helps foster relationships and friendships within courses. And it adds in a social element that sometimes you wouldn't otherwise get so much from an asynchronous online course. So there was one study that I came across when I was doing more research on this that talked about how some of the graduate students who were using MLC groups found that it helped them form lasting friendships. And I found that this is consistent with my own experiences using MLC groups in my teaching. So how are we actually going to do this in our class? Well, here I'm going to talk a little bit about the overall process. I'm not going to go too much into the specifics of assignments, just because the two courses I'm doing right now, and indeed maybe future classes that I might reuse this video for, may have slightly different assignments, but the overall group process is very similar. So I will say that for both of these classes, please do refer to your syllabus and to your MLC guide for more information on the assignment specifically. So the MLC groups are these small literature circles of about 4 to 5 students that you'll be working in the semester. And there's 4 roles, which you're going to rotate throughout our MLC module weeks. So there's the director, there is the discussant, the summarizer, and the commentator. So let's talk a little bit about what each of these roles do. So the director has a major writing piece that they're going to be doing each week, and this looks a little bit different across both of my courses. So if you are in EDU 5101, you will be writing a reader response paper, and if you are in EDU 5499, you will be writing the assessment case study. Either way, the process is pretty similar. You're going to be writing your paper, whichever one it is, depending on your class, and it gets circulated to your group members. And these papers that you're writing are meant to be more of a personal response to the readings, and the specifics for each are outlined in the syllabus. But in short, it's really important that you're bringing your perspective and your experiences into this. Neither of these assignments is meant to be just a reiteration of what's in the readings. So your paper is then shared with your group for discussion, and then throughout the 2 weeks that you're doing a lot of back and forth with your group can also give you feedback and suggestions for revising your paper before you submit it to us for assessment. And then the discussant is really the leader for the discussion part of your module. So their initial role is that they're going to be coming up with some questions based on both the paper that the director sends out, and then also on a supplementary material that the summarizer is going to be identifying. So they write these discussion questions, they send them out to the group, and then these are going to kind of be what you center your discussions on that you have over the course of, if you're asynchronous, it could be a few days, or if you're a synchronous group, it could be just 1 or 2 meetings. And as a tip for the discussant, having an agenda to help guide your discussion, particularly if you are in a synchronous group, is really, really helpful about keeping everyone on track. And the summarizer has 2 tasks. So the summarizer's first task is they need to find some sort of supplementary material to share with the rest of the group. And this is really where that multiliteracy piece comes in. So, I mean, if you want to bring in another research article, you are more than welcome to, but we also encourage you to look at things like websites, book reviews, blog posts. Students love sharing videos, news articles, things like that. And then during the meeting, your role is to take notes on what's being discussed in your group. And then based on this, you'll write a short summary that you'll post to Brightspace to share with the rest of the class. And then the final role is the commentator, and their responsibilities really come at the end of the module. So once the summarizers have posted their summaries of their group's discussions, the commentator then goes in, reads all the posts by the different groups, writes up a short summary, which they then share back with their group. And this summary depending on the group, sometimes gets approached a little bit differently. So in the past, I've had students who just go, group by group, and they say, Team Alpha discussed this, Team Bravo discussed this. I've had other students who just kind of do an overarching summary, and they talk about the overarching themes that they saw as they were reading through them. And then I've seen students who do kind of a combination. So they may do some bullet points for some of the really key points that came up in each group. And then at the end, they kind of talk about overarching themes or points of disagreement that they saw between the different posts. And how you approach this is really up to you. So the general flow of this whole process is at the beginning of the module, everyone's going to be doing the readings. And then based on this, your director is going to write up their assignment, whichever one it is, whether it's a reader response or the case study, and they will send that out to the rest of the group. At the same time as the reader response lead or discussant, or what do we call it? Director, I'm sorry, we recently changed the name and I'm trying to be consistent so I don't confuse you. So the director, while they are writing up their paper to circulate with the class, the summarizer will be identifying that supplementary resource that they want to share with the rest of their group. Those both get sent out. And then based on this, the discussant starts coming up with some questions. So what are some questions they have about what the director wrote? What are some questions that arose for them from the readings? What are some questions they have about the supplementary resource that got sent out? So they draft these questions and then they circulate it to the rest of the group. And then this kind of forms the agenda or the structure for the subsequent discussion that the group has. And we'll talk a little bit about that meeting in a moment. So once the groups had their meeting, the summarizer taking their notes while everyone was talking, the summarizers then post this to the discussion boards, and then the commentators come in, read through everything, write their little summary, and then they share that with their group. And then the next module starts. So before we talk a little bit about the meeting, I just want to quickly talk briefly about deadlines for this. So you'll see in the MLC guide that we have circulated to you, we do have some proposed timelines and deadlines for you to follow. And this is based on what's worked well for previous students. We've also outlined some due dates and tables for each of these roles, which you can see here. And you may want to shift these around a little bit depending on your schedules. While we have recommended one meeting during the module, for synchronous groups, for example, I have found, at least in the past, that often synchronous groups prefer to meet weekly and kind of keep that routine going. As long as your group's happy with whatever you've decided to do for a schedule and it's not impeding anyone's learning, we are happy for you to choose an approach that works best for your group. However, there are some hard deadlines. So the start and the stop date for the module, that's going to be consistent across groups. We also want the commentators to have their summary then back to their group by the end of the module. So therefore, we do also ask that the summarizers do have their summaries posted by the second Thursday of the module. And that gives the commentators a few days to go in and do the reading. I have had in the past some students posting their summaries on Sunday night, so right as the module's ending, and that's really, really stressful for the commentators. So please try to get those in a timely fashion. And then, of course, the assignments, whether they be your reader response or your assessment case study, are due the Wednesday following the completion of that module. So if you're in 5101, for example, if you are the reader response lead or director, I'm sorry, I keep mixing up the names. If you are the director for standardized education and you are writing the reader response paper for that week, it will be due the first Wednesday of authentic education. And this just gives you a few days to kind of make a few changes based on what your group has said before you submit it to us. So now touching briefly on the meeting you're going to have with your group. So you have a couple of different options for how you choose to meet. So you can meet either asynchronously, which means that you're meeting at separate times, so to speak. So someone posts something and then they maybe on their lunch break at work and they go back to work and then someone checks it after work. So you're not online at the same time necessarily. You can also meet synchronously, which means that you have set a day and a time where you want to meet, say via video conferencing, and you have your discussion that way. So you may choose one approach that works well with your groups, or you may choose to switch it up a little bit depending on the module. I do find that groups that meet synchronously do get more out of this process. And a few examples of how other students have approached this is I've had students talking via WhatsApp, Google Docs, Zoom, benefit of which is that you can record your discussion and go back to it later. I've seen students do PowerPoints with a notes section for their discussion. So on the slide, they'll have the discussion question and then little presenter notes at the bottom. They'll have their little discussion down there. You can also use the Brightsboard discussion boards. I always give my students this option, but to date, I have never had a group actually use the discussion board space beyond, generally getting organized, swapping contact info, stuff like that. Students are usually pretty keen to get off of Brightspace. So you have that option. It is up to you. Now, before I go into some specific tips to help you with this process and hopefully help you, get a better grade, I just want to talk a little bit about the MLC Portfolio. So the MLC Portfolio is meant to be a collection of your work that showcases the record of your learning throughout the semester in the MLC modules. So in these classes, this is going to be a Google Doc that will email to you. And the reason why we do the Google Doc is so we can kind of check in with you and see how you're doing. So to make sure that you are updating your portfolio, sometimes there could be a major issue going on within the group that maybe you haven't felt comfortable emailing us, but we can pick up on it in your portfolio, and then hopefully we can address things very quickly. So here you're going to document your artifacts for that week. So if you're the discussant, you will put your discussion questions in there. And then you're also going to be reflecting on the group process and your learning from that module. So part of this will be applying these concepts to your future practice, and then also reflecting on how this learning is relevant to your philosophy of assessment or philosophy of teaching, depending on which course you're in. So the MLC Portfolio has 6 prompts that we're going to ask you to reflect on for each module. So your role, so for that, you're literally just writing in your role. So director, for example. So your artifacts, so you want to include your artifacts from that module. So for example, if you're the director, you would want to have your assessment dilemma case study there. If you're the discussant, you would want to have your discussion questions, etc. And then we have a little what went well, where you get to reflect on what went well in your MLC meeting. And then we also have even better ifs, or EBIs. So how could your meeting have been better? And how might your group address this in the next module to make it better? New learning, so you're going to talk about what you learned in this module that you didn't previously know or hadn't previously considered, and how you might apply it to your future practice. And then connections to your philosophy. So here you're going to be reflecting on how some of these ideas impact or maybe don't impact your philosophy of teaching if you are in EDU 5101, or your philosophy of assessment if you're in EDU 5499. So now let's get into some tips to help make this process a little bit easier for you. So I have done MLCs in 2 courses previously, and I'm doing them, as I'm sure you've gathered now, in 2 this semester. So these are some tips that I have gathered from my own experience as well as from talking to some of my students. So my first one isn't so much a tip as it is a reassurance, but the first week is confusing, and this is completely normal. MLC is much more complex than the traditional online discussions that I'm sure many of you have had in previous courses that were online. So, you make one post and then by a certain date you have to respond to 2 more. And at least in my experience, I find that this tends to result in pretty shallow learning, especially when you get a lot of people doing things night before, and then you don't get as much engagement amongst class members, and you don't form those relationships between the learners. But as a result, of course, with all these different roles and the way this is structured, it is much more complex. However, in my experience, I have found that once you've gone through this whole cycle for one module, it is much easier and it's much clearer once you've walked through it once. And this is something that my previous students have also reflected on in their portfolios. So a lot of the times I notice for their first module, there's a lot of even better ifs and a lot of confusion, and a lot of people saying that, they struggled with the different deadlines and things like that. And then once they do their second module, usually the reflection is like, oh, it went so much better this week. Like I had a much clearer idea of what we were doing. Things flowed really well. We had a good discussion. So if you're struggling in the first module, just know that that's normal. We expect it. But if you have any questions, of course, do reach out to us. My second tip, and probably the most important one, is update your portfolio regularly. So the portfolio portion of this group work is probably the easiest portion of all of it, so long as you're updating it regularly. And then, of course, engaging in the reflection questions is going to help contribute to your learning as you're going through each of the modules. Something that I've seen a few times, unfortunately, though, is students leaving this piece until either much later in the course or just a few days before the MLC portfolio is due. I've also had some students who just don't fill out the reflection questions. And if you leave it all to the end, of course, it's going to be a lot more difficult because, you may not remember what you did in Module 3. You may not remember, what went really well in Module 3 or what could have been done better. And of course, because you're not engaging in the reflective learning, your learning won't be as rich. So make a habit of going in once a week or so, even if it's just a matter of going in every once in a while and adding in a few bullet points so you remember and so you can build on it a little bit later. Just try to keep on top of things. My third tip is to use your EBIs to improve your group work. So try to come up with some actionable ideas too of things that you can actually do to make your group process go better. For example, one that came up a lot last semester was a lot of students saying, it would have been a lot easier as a discussant if we'd had an agenda to follow. So not only will coming up with things like this help your group process, but it will probably actually give you a higher grade. And then my next one is try to meet synchronously if possible. I found in the past that groups that meet synchronously have much richer discussion than if they were to meet asynchronously. And you can also pick up on things that you can't pick up on so much asynchronously, like people's tone and things like that. If you can do a video conferencing, you can pick up on body language, stuff like that. So it also makes the group process go a little bit better. And previous students that I've had that have met synchronously before said that, during the pandemic and being in lockdown a lot of the time, being able to meet synchronously like with this group actually gave them some socialization and kind of a sense of normalcy during all of this. And a lot of them also really enjoyed getting to meet with each other every week. And some of them did comment also that they had formed some friendships that were going to carry over into their other courses and beyond. So if you can meet synchronously, I recommend it. But of course, I know that that's not possible for everyone, especially in healthcare where a lot of you work shift work, and it's not possible sometimes. That different time zones can also make this difficult, although I will say based on the 2 times I've done this previously, I find the groups with the biggest difference in time zones tend to be the ones that meet synchronously for whatever reason. I've had ones previously where I've had students across Canada and the US in a variety of time zones, and then also overseas in places like China and Australia, and somehow they still managed to make it work, which is very impressive. And of course, you could also have learners with exceptionalities in your group that could make it very difficult to meet through something like video conferencing, so asynchronous could work much better for your group in that situation. In a situation like that, you could also meet synchronously, but just do it text-based. So last semester I had a group that met, I think it was every Sunday morning, and even though it was synchronous, they did it all text-based, so they were all there. I think they did it on their phones, but so they'd all be on their phones for an hour Sunday mornings, and they would discuss the readings and discuss what was going on. So it's another option for you. And my final tip is make your portfolio your own. So the portfolio is meant to capture your learning and your reflections, so make it personal to you. And I know that yes, we do post some very specific questions, but there are still ways that you can really personalize this to yourself. So in the past, I have had students who have brought in pictures and artifacts from their own work where they were talking about the links between what they're seeing in the readings and what they're doing in their practice. I've also had students who bring in things like mind maps, whether they be ones that they did specifically on some of the readings, or in EDU 5101, I've had students bring in their learning theories mind map from week 2 and then reflect on it in subsequent modules and talk about, are they still happy with it? Are there things that they would like to add? Things like that. I've also had parents that connect some of the readings to things that they have seen in their children's own educational experiences. And these are all really great ways to make your portfolio more personable and more novel, which not only, better learning process for you, but probably a higher grade. And that's all for now, folks. I hope this video helped demystify the MLC group work, because I know it's a little confusing when you're first starting out. As I said earlier, do make sure that you are referring to the syllabus and the MLC guide that we've sent out to you, since there's a lot more detail in those documents, and we do go into more of the really course-specific stuff. And if you have any further questions as you're reviewing these documents, you can either post something in the Ask Us a Question document, or you can email us. And that's all for now. Happy MLCing, and I will see you all online.